The moment my daughter-in-law excused herself to check on the kids during my grandson's birthday party, the man sitting beside me at the picnic table leaned close and pressed a folded paper into my hand. He was maybe 75, wore a Korea veteran's cap, and his eyes were the kind that had seen things they couldn't unsee. He said quietly enough that only I could hear, "Don't sign anything tonight, Harold. Read page 3 first." Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the parking lot like he just said nothing more important than pass the salt. My son hadn't even noticed. He was chasing my 4-year-old grandson around the yard with a garden hose, both of them shrieking. The paper was already warm in my palm. I'd been retired for 6 years. 31 years as a civil engineer with the county, then knee surgery, then my wife Evelyn's diagnosis, then the longest 2 years of my life watching her lose her battle with ovarian cancer. After she died, the house on Clemens Road felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer existed. Every room the same, her reading glasses still on the nightstand. I couldn't throw them away. I still haven't. My son, who I'll call by the name he goes by, my son, who lives 40 minutes away in Dunmore, had been after me for 2 years to get my affairs in order. Reasonable enough. I was 68 years old, with bad knees, a house worth close to $400,000, and a retirement account that Evelyn and I had spent 30 years building together. After she died, all of it fell to me, and then presumably to him someday. Nothing unusual about any of that. What was unusual was his wife. She'd come into his life 3 years before Evelyn passed. He brought her home for Thanksgiving, and I remembered thinking she was charming in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, like someone who'd studied charm rather than grown into it. Evelyn had whispered to me later that night while we were washing dishes, "Something's off about her, Harold. I can't say what." I told her she was being unfair. I think about that often now. After Evelyn died, my daughter-in-law became indispensable. She organized the funeral arrangements. She set up meal deliveries. She drove me to doctor's appointments when my son was traveling for work, which was increasingly often. She started handling little things, calling the insurance company, managing the cable account, even talking to my accountant about end-of-year tax paperwork. One task at a time, she made herself necessary. I told myself it was kindness. That's what grief does to you. It makes you want to believe the best of people, because the alternative is too exhausting to consider. But sitting at that picnic table with a folded piece of paper in my hand, I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. I waited until I could slip away to the bathroom inside the house. The upstairs one, away from the party noise. I locked the door and unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of a letter on legal stationery. The law firm's name at the top meant nothing to me, Greer and Ashford, LLC, but the date was 3 weeks ago, and the subject line stopped my breath clean. Guardianship petition. Harold Vincent Marsh. My name. My full name, with a petition number. I read it twice, then a third time, slower, because I kept thinking I was misunderstanding something. The letter was from the law firm to someone whose name was redacted in the copy, but the content was clear enough. A formal guardianship petition had been filed in the county probate court, citing concerns about my cognitive decline, my inability to manage my financial affairs, and my vulnerability to making decisions detrimental to my own welfare. Attached references included a psychological assessment by someone named Dr. Aldous Fenwick, dated 6 weeks prior. The assessment described moderate cognitive impairment consistent with early-stage dementia. I had never heard of Dr. Aldous Fenwick. I had never heard of Dr. Aldous Fenwick. I had never had a psychological assessment. My physician of 11 years, Dr. Carmichael at the Belmore Clinic, had given me a full physical 4 months ago and told me my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. His words. But there, in a photocopy of a legal letter, was documentation of a condition I didn't have, signed by a doctor I'd never met, being used to petition a court to take away my right to manage my own life. I gripped the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. 68 years old, gray at the temples. The face of a man who had built bridges for a living and outlasted more than most people are asked to outlast. I knew who I was. The question was, who else was in that courtroom with my name on a filing? I tucked the paper into my shirt pocket and went back downstairs. My daughter-in-law was cutting the birthday cake. She looked up when I came through the back door and smiled, that wide, warm smile I'd spent 2 years accepting at face value. "There you are." I was about to send a search party. "Just old knees," I said. "Needed a minute." My son handed me a plate with a slice of chocolate cake, and I stood there eating it and watching her move around the yard, and I thought about Evelyn's words at the kitchen sink. Something's off about her, Harold. 3 years too late to say she was right. The man with the Korea veteran's cap was gone. His car, a burgundy Buick, I noticed it on the way in, was no longer in front of the house. I didn't know his name. I didn't know how he knew mine. But he'd handed me something that felt like a lifeline, and now I had to figure out what to do with it. I couldn't call my son. Not yet. Not until I knew how much he knew and whether he was part of it or being used the same way I was. That thought, that my own son might be complicit, was something I set in a mental box and closed the lid on. I couldn't carry it and function at the same time. That night, after the party, I drove home alone. The house on Clemens Road was quiet the way it always is now. I sat at the kitchen table with the photocopy and my laptop and spent 3 hours learning everything I could about guardianship fraud in Pennsylvania. What I found made me feel sick in a way that settled into my bones and stayed there. Guardianship abuse. The legal kind, the kind with real attorneys and real court filings, was not rare. Predators identified vulnerable adults, typically elderly, typically recently widowed, typically with significant assets. They build relationships of trust over months or years. Then they filed for legal guardianship using fabricated or exaggerated medical assessments, often provided by complicit or negligent physicians. Once guardianship was granted, the guardian controlled everything: housing, medical care, finances. The victim had almost no legal recourse because the court had already decided they couldn't manage their own affairs. Victims disappeared into the system. Families were told they were not cooperative with the care plan. Assets were liquidated slowly, quietly. By the time anyone noticed, the money was gone and the trail was cold. I read survivor accounts until midnight. Then I sat in the dark kitchen for a while longer, thinking about what Evelyn had seen in 30 seconds at a Thanksgiving dinner that had taken me 3 years to almost miss entirely. At 7 the next morning, I drove to the Korean War Veterans Chapter Hall on Sycamore Street. It was the only lead I had. The man had worn their cap. If I was lucky, someone there would know him. The hall opened at 9. A woman at the front desk with reading glasses on a chain around her neck looked up when I came in. I described the man, the cap, the age, the way he carried himself, and she nodded before I finished. "That sounds like August." August Prentice, 77 years old, had served in Korea and spent the 30 years after fighting the VA for benefits his fellow veterans were owed. The woman at the desk, she'd known him since he was in his 40s, said he'd been coming in less frequently lately, that he'd gotten quiet after something happened to his older brother 2 years ago. She gave me his number without much hesitation, which surprised me. He told me someone might come asking, she said. Said to give it out. He answered on the second ring. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, far enough from my neighborhood that I didn't worry about running into my daughter-in-law's network of connections. August Prentice was compact and deliberate in the way of men who learned early not to waste motion. He shook my hand and looked at me with the same steady assessment I remembered from the picnic table. "You read it," he said. "Where did you get it?" "My brother's caseworker. She's the one who noticed the pattern." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. My brother's name was Leonard. He was 73, widower, retired electrician, owned a house in Scranton, had a pension and savings. He met a woman through his grief support group about 2 years after his wife passed. She was attentive, patient, good at listening. He paused. Sound familiar? It sounded very familiar. She helped him with paperwork at first, then his finances. Then she connected him with a therapist who specialized in grief counseling for seniors. That therapist, a man named Fenwick, started seeing Leonard weekly. Within 4 months, Leonard had been assessed as cognitively impaired. Within 6 months, a guardianship petition had been filed by a woman named... He stopped. What's your daughter-in-law's name? My son calls her by her nickname. But her full name, the one she signs documents with, is Renata Wick. Something shifted in August Prentice's face. Not surprise, something worse than surprise. Recognition. Renata Wick, he said carefully. Or Renata Wickham. She uses Wick professionally. I don't know her original last name. He reached into his jacket and set a folded paper on the table between us. It was a printout of a court filing. The petitioner in Leonard Prentice's guardianship case was listed as Renata S. Wickham. We sat with that for a moment. Leonard died 14 months ago, August said. Official cause was a medication interaction. He was being managed at a residential care facility called Birchwood Commons. Renata was his legal guardian by then. His bank accounts had been largely depleted, transfers to a nonprofit called Senior Horizons Foundation. She was the executive director. His house was in the process of being sold when he died. He looked down at his coffee. I tried to stop it. I went to the court. I went to Adult Protective Services. I filed a complaint with the state medical board about Fenwick. They told me the paperwork was in order. The assessment was signed by a licensed clinician. The court had already ruled. He exhaled. By the time Leonard was declared incompetent, he couldn't help himself, and the law was structured to prevent me from helping him. I stared at the court filing. My brother's name in the spot where mine was almost certainly headed. How many? I asked. That I've confirmed? 8, including Leonard. But the pattern goes back further than I can trace on my own. Fenwick has been in practice for 12 years. Renata has been attached to Senior Horizons in various forms for at least 9. He met my eyes. You're the first target who's received a warning in time. Why me? How did you even know to be at my grandson's birthday party? I didn't know about the party specifically. I've been watching Renata, quietly from a distance for almost 2 years. When I saw how she was positioning herself with your family, the appointments she was scheduling, the advisor she connected you with for your estate planning, the documents she'd asked you to review, I knew the timeline was accelerating. He set down his coffee. The party was opportunistic. I've been watching the house. When I saw her herding the guests and making sure you were occupied, I took the chance. I thought about the party. The way she'd organized everything, the name tags, the specific seating arrangement she'd insisted on. At the time, it had seemed like efficiency. Now I understood she'd been managing sightlines. She was going to have me sign something tonight, I said. It wasn't a question. Estate planning documents is my guess, combined with a request to formalize the financial power of attorney she's been preparing. Once she has that and Fenwick's assessment on record, the guardianship petition becomes almost automatic. He slid a business card across the table. There's an attorney named Sunderland in Pittsburgh who handles elder abuse cases. She's been building a file on Renata for 10 months. She needs a living witness who received the documents before the guardianship was finalized. That's you. I picked up the card. The name on it was Irene Sunderland, Elder Law, and Victims Advocacy. What do you need from me? The real financial records. Renata would have kept documentation, she has to make the transfers look legitimate for the nonprofit filings. Tax records, transfer authorizations, Fenwick's billing records. If she's been accessing your accounts, there will be a digital trail. Does she have access to any of your financial accounts? She did. I'd given her view access to my main checking account a year ago so she could help me track medical expenses after a minor procedure. It had seemed reasonable at the time. It had seemed like help. She has login credentials, I said. Not transfer authority, not yet. Then your accounts are still intact. But she'll move to secure that authority soon. August leaned forward slightly. There's something else. She may have already drafted documents with your signature pre-filled. It's happened with other victims. Forms signed at moments of distraction or fatigue. Do you recall signing anything in the last 6 months that you didn't read fully? I sat very still. There had been a moment in February. I'd been recovering from a bad flu. She'd come by with soup and groceries, genuinely kind, or what read as genuinely kind. There had been a stack of papers she'd brought, something about updating my estate beneficiaries to reflect Evelyn's death. She'd flagged the relevant lines. I'd signed where she pointed. I hadn't read every page. I told August. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had heard this particular sentence 8 times before. "That's likely your signature on the financial power of attorney," he said quietly. "Dated from when you were vulnerable. Combined with Fenwick's assessment, it's almost airtight." He looked at me steadily. "Almost. Not completely. Not if we can prove the assessment was fabricated, the documents were obtained under false pretense, and the nonprofit is a vehicle for fraud. Sunderland has most of that. She needs the internal records. You want me to get them. I want you to decide whether you're willing to try. It means going home, behaving normally, not confronting Renata yet, and finding access to her records before she realizes you know." I thought about my son, 40 minutes away, who believed his wife was helping his father grieve, who had probably been reassured many times that his father was struggling more than he let on, who may have been handed small, carefully chosen pieces of a story designed to make my competence look like bravado and my resistance look like symptoms. "Is my son in danger?" I asked. "Not physically. But his marriage is built on a lie, and that reckoning is coming regardless of what you do." August paused. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Evelyn always said she knew. I called Irene Sunderland's office that afternoon. She answered herself, which told me something. I summarized everything. The letter, August's information, the February document signing. She listened without interrupting, which told me more. "Mr. Marsh," she said when I finished, "I need you to understand what you're walking into. Renata Wickham is careful, and she has resources. If she suspects you're gathering evidence, she won't wait for the court process. She'll move to have you placed in protective care immediately, using Fenwick's assessment and the power of attorney. Once you're in a facility, your access to outside contact becomes her decision." "What do I need to get you?" "Her financial records. Transfer authorizations. Any communications between her and Fenwick. If she keeps files at your home, anything she's left there or asked you to store, those would be invaluable." She did keep files at my home. She had what she called a family coordination binder in my home office, something she'd set up when she started helping with my medical appointments. I'd thought it was organization. I'd thanked her for it. "Give me 3 days," I said. Going home that evening and behaving normally was the hardest thing I've done since I sat with Evelyn in her last week and pretended not to be terrified. My daughter-in-law called at 7 to check on me. Warm voice. Gentle questions about whether I'd eaten, whether my knees were bothering me, whether I needed anything. I told her I was fine, that the party had been wonderful, that I was tired but good. "We should sit down this week," she said. "Go over those estate documents from February, just to make sure everything is updated the way you wanted." "Of course," I said, "Thursday works." She didn't know I'd already read page 3. The next 2 days I moved carefully. I didn't change my routine. I went to my Chute coffee group at the senior center. I got my prescription filled. I called my son and talked to him for an hour about nothing consequential. His job, my grandson's new obsession with dinosaurs, whether I wanted to come to their 4th of July cookout, normal, ordinary, the conversation of a father and son who had no idea anything was wrong. On Wednesday evening, after I was certain my daughter-in-law wasn't driving past my neighborhood, she sometimes did, I'd noticed, which I'd filed away as affectionate concern and now understood differently. I opened the family coordination binder. It was meticulous. Tab sections for medical, financial, legal, property, copies of documents I'd signed, copies of documents I hadn't known existed with what appeared to be my signature, correspondence between her and a financial advisor I'd been introduced to last spring who I'd trusted because she'd vouched for him. Billing records from Fenwick's practice, labeled as reimbursable elder care coordination expenses, submitted through Senior Horizons. In the legal tab, there was a draft guardianship petition, my name, A filing date 2 weeks out. I photographed every page with my phone. Then I called Irene Sunderland. She had a process server and 2 federal agents at my kitchen table by 9 the next morning. I want to be precise about what happened after that, because the details matter. When my daughter-in-law arrived for our Thursday meeting, she was greeted at my door not by a confused old man with paperwork, but by Irene Sunderland and the federal investigation she'd been quietly building for 10 months. The financial records I'd photographed became the evidentiary anchor for warrants that had been waiting on exactly that kind of documentation. Dr. Aldous Fenwick was arrested at his office that same afternoon. His practice record showed 8 fraudulent psychological assessments over 6 years, all connected to guardianship petitions where the petitioner was tied directly or indirectly to Renata Wickham or Senior Horizons Foundation. The residents currently under Renata's guardianship, 6 of them, all elderly men, were moved to legitimate care facilities within 72 hours. 3 of them were in good enough health to testify. 2 were in condition that the attorneys described carefully as compromised but improving. 1 had died the previous spring. His estate, according to the foundation records, had been entirely liquidated. 7 people in total were charged. Renata faced 39 counts including fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy. Fenwick faced state medical board revocation proceedings in addition to criminal charges. The financial advisor she'd recommended to me, the one I'd trusted because she'd vouched for him, had been routing account transfers through a shell company for 4 years. My son came to my house the evening of the arrests. He didn't say anything for a long time. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd eaten 1,000 meals as a child and looked at the wall. I didn't try to fill the silence. Some silences need to breathe. Eventually he said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't. I thought she was helping you." "So did I." He looked at me then, and his face had the kind of grief in it that has no clean expression. Not for me. I'd made it through. For himself. For the marriage he'd built on a foundation he didn't know was hollow. For the conversations he'd had with his wife about his father's decline that he now had to re-examine from the beginning. "Mom would have caught it faster," he said. "She tried to," I told him. And I told him about the kitchen sink Thanksgiving 3 years ago. Evelyn, with her hands in the dishwater, saying something's off about her. I can't say what. He was quiet again for a while. "What do I do now?" "That," I said, "is a question for a different evening. Tonight you just sit here." He did. We ordered delivery and ate at the kitchen table and talked about his son's dinosaur phase, and neither of us pretended the conversation was uncomplicated. But some things you get through by simply staying in the room. The trial was long and the coverage was local and then national after a reporter in Philadelphia picked up the angle about the scope of the scheme. I testified for 2 days. Irene Sunderland prepared me thoroughly, but in the end, the most important testimony was simple. I told the court what happened, what I'd signed and why, what I'd been told about my own mental state, what the documents showed versus what was true. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 31 years writing technical reports that had to be accurate enough to hold up bridges. I know how to be precise. Renata's defense argued that she had acted in good faith based on clinical assessments, that the transfers were authorized, that I was a hostile witness motivated by embarrassment over my cognitive decline. They were thorough. They were not convincing. She was convicted on 27 of 39 counts. Fenwick lost his medical license and was sentenced to 12 years. The financial advisor received 7. Renata received 22 years. She'll be in her early 60s when she gets out. She'll have spent those years with the knowledge that every one of the people she considered easy targets turned out to be something else entirely. Senior Horizons Foundation was dissolved. The remaining assets, not much, most have been funneled out, were distributed to the victims and their families under court supervision. August Prentice was in the courtroom for the verdict. We'd gotten into the habit of meeting on Wednesday mornings at the coffee shop near the courthouse, and that habit has continued. We talk about Leonard, about the other men, about the ones who don't have an August watching from a parking lot, who don't get a folded piece of paper pressed into their hand in time. That's why we started working with Irene's office to develop a resource guide for adult children and aging parents. What to look for, how to document it, who to call. We got a room at the local library and ran an information session last spring. 40 people showed up. We run it quarterly now. My son filed for divorce. It was a process, and it was painful, and he handled it with more grace than I had any right to expect from someone whose entire adult domestic life turned out to be built on performance. He's doing better. My grandson is thriving in a way that children manage even when the adults around them are struggling. Kids are resilient in ways that sometimes break your heart with gratitude. Evelyn's reading glasses are still on the nightstand. I stopped feeling like I had to move them. I tell this story when I get asked to speak. At the library sessions, at the Veterans Hall, at the Senior Center on Tuesday mornings. I tell it because the version I almost lived, the one without August at the picnic table, without the folded paper, without the warning, that version ends very differently. I know that. I know it in the particular way you know the shape of the thing that almost happened to you. What I want people to understand is this. The predators who target elderly people with money and grief and trust, they are not rare and they are not obvious. They look like kindness. They sound like help. They come in at the moment when you are most tired and most grateful for someone to shoulder a little of the weight, and they make themselves indispensable one small reasonable step at a time. The warning signs are real, and they are learnable. Someone inserting themselves between you and your existing advisors. Someone who manages logistics in ways that reduce your direct contact with financial institutions. Someone who schedules your appointments, meets your doctors, reviews your mail. Someone who makes you feel, slowly and gently, that you need more help than you thought you did. Trust yourself. Trust the people who loved you before you needed help. And if something feels off, if there is a moment at a birthday party or a family dinner or a quiet Wednesday afternoon where your gut says, wait, something is wrong, trust that instinct the way you would trust your own name. Because that instinct is you, still intact, still sharp, still fighting for yourself. And sometimes that's what saves your life.